My name is Diana Marsh. I am 41 years old and I design spaces for a living. Not simply rooms. That is the short version people use at cocktail parties when they want to move on to someone else's occupation. What I actually do is study the way people inhabit a space before I alter it. Because a room is not an aesthetic problem, it is a behavioral one. The question I ask at the beginning of every project is not, "What do you want this to look like?" but "How do you want to feel when you walk through this door?" The answer to that question tells me everything I need to know: where the light should land, where the weight should sit, what the room should ask of the person inside it. I have been running my own residential design firm for 11 years. I have learned, across those years, that the homes people commission reveal more about them than any conversation does. People tell you who they are in the rooms they build. They cannot help it. The proportions they choose, the surfaces they specify, the way they orient a sofa toward or away from the window. All of it is confession, and all of it is legible if you are paying attention. I was not, it turned out, paying sufficient attention to my own family. This is the part I return to most, in the 18 months since everything happened. A woman who reads rooms for a living should be able to read the room she grew up in. She should be able to see the architecture of the dysfunction, the load-bearing walls of the favoritism, the places where the structure had been quietly compromised for decades before it came down all at once. I did not see it. Or rather, I saw parts of it, named them privately, filed them away, and continued showing up anyway, because families are the one place most of us suspend the analytical habits we would apply everywhere else. We love despite the evidence, which is either the most human thing about us or the most costly, and usually both at the same time. I want to start at the moment I found out I had been uninvited, because that is where the story breaks the surface, and then I will take you underneath it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September, 9 days before the wedding. I was at a client's house in the Highlands neighborhood of Denver, standing in a gutted kitchen, assessing the structural wall we were proposing to remove to open the space to the garden view. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I glanced at it between measurements and saw my sister's name, which was not unusual. Paige had been calling me every few days for 6 months with some new wedding logistical question, and I had become, effectively, the operational backbone of an event I had also substantially financed, which felt, in the moment, like the natural order of things. I had always been the operational backbone. It was simply how the family had arranged itself. I stepped outside to take the call. Paige did not say hello. She said, in the voice of someone who has rehearsed a speech until the delivery is smooth, but the emotion underneath it is not quite managed. "Diana, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I said I was listening. She said that after a great deal of thought, and conversation with Brendan, and with Mom and Dad, she had decided that it would be better for everyone if I did not attend the wedding. She said the word "decided" with the particular weight of someone using language as insulation. A decision is a closed matter, not subject to revision. She said Brendan had shared some things with her that he had observed over the past year, concerns about my behavior and my intentions, and that she needed to prioritize her relationship and her day. She said she hoped I understood that this was not about love, that she would always love me, that she hoped in time we could move past this and rebuild. She said this in one breath, approximately, and when she finished there was a silence, and I could hear that she was waiting for the response that the speech had been designed to manage: the tears, the pleading, the protest. "I did not provide those things," I said. "The venue contract is in my name. The caterer has a deposit of $12,000 on my credit card. The florist, the photographer, the string quartet, and the cake baker are all contracted through my firm's vendor account. I'll need to know how you'd like to handle the transfer of those obligations." A longer silence. "Diana, I'm not being cruel," I said, and I meant it. I'm being practical. You've made a decision about the guest list, and that's yours to make. The contracts need to be addressed regardless. Tell me what you want to do. She said she would talk to Brendan and call me back. She did not call me back that day, or the next. On the third day, I sent an email to my sister, my mother, and the family's shared address that my father used, detailing every outstanding financial obligation connected to the wedding, the amounts on my credit card, the contracts in my name, and a specific request to advise me within 48 hours on how they wish to proceed. The email was written the way I write every professional communication, clearly, without emotional content, with specific requests and specific timelines. My mother called 20 minutes after I sent it. She was crying, which is my mother's first instrument in any conflict. Not manipulatively, I believe, but genuinely, because my mother is a woman for whom emotion is always the surface-level presentation of something she has not examined deeply enough to name. She said this was not the time for spreadsheets, that her daughter was getting married in 6 days, that I was making this about money. I said I was making it about contracts that bore my legal signature and represented $83,000 of my personal expenditure and credit. She said I was always so cold. I let that go, because I have been letting that go for 41 years. I said, Mom, I need to know who is assuming these contracts. That's all I'm asking. She said Brendan's parents would figure something out, and that I should not do anything rash, and that she hoped I would come to my senses before the wedding. I've been uninvited, I said. I'm not the one who needs to come to my senses. She cried more and ended the call, and I went back to the gutted kitchen and looked at the structural wall and thought, with the very clear and quiet part of my brain that operates independently of whatever is happening emotionally, I need to document everything. Let me go back. Paige is 7 years younger than me. She is, and has always been, beautiful in the kind of way that functions as a social currency, the kind that gets cashed constantly and invisibly until the person carrying it stops being aware that transactions are happening at all. She is warm, she is quick to laugh. She has an ease with people that I have never had and have spent 41 years watching her deploy with the effortlessness of someone for whom the world has consistently confirmed that ease is the right approach. I do not say any of this critically. It is description. Paige is genuinely lovable. The family's orientation toward her has always been, at its core, a response to something real about her. What it did to me, growing up in the shadow of that orientation, is a longer conversation that I have been having with a therapist in Denver for 3 years and will not reconstruct in its entirety here. What is relevant is this. I learned early to be useful. Useful was what I had instead of effortless. Useful was the currency I traded in, and I had traded in it so long and so consistently that I had stopped examining whether the exchange rate was fair. Our parents, Frank and Carol, are not bad people. I have arrived at this conclusion after considerable examination, because the easy conclusion, bad people, deliberate favoritism, malice aforethought, would be simpler but would not be accurate. They are people of limited self-awareness who fell in love with one of their children in the unconditional way and loved the other in a way that was always, implicitly, contingent on something. The contingency was never named. It did not need to be named. It operated at a level below language, in the 1,000 small calibrations of attention and warmth that constitute what a family is, and that I cataloged the way I would later learn to catalog the details of a room, noting the discrepancies, filing them away, continuing to show up. I had been supporting my family financially, in modest and then less modest ways, since I opened my firm 11 years ago. Not because they were destitute. My father had worked in insurance for 30 years and they were comfortable, but because I was successful, and they were my family, and the money felt like a form of the love I was always trying to produce in an acceptable denomination. I had paid for 2 of Paige's vacations when she was between jobs in her late 20s, covered my parents' roof replacement 4 years ago, and helped with a medical bill my father had incurred during a hospitalization the previous winter. None of this had been asked for loudly. It had been asked for in the particular quiet way of people who have learned that you will offer if they simply describe the problem in your presence. The wedding offer had been mine without asking. Paige got engaged to Brendan Holloway 14 months before the date, and I offered to contribute significantly to the wedding because I was the one in the family with the means to do it, and because I had a professional network in the event design world that could get quality vendors at rates unavailable to the general public, and because, I am being honest here, some part of me understood that this was the most significant gift I could give my sister for the most significant event of her life, and I wanted to give it. I wanted her to have the day she imagined. I want that on the record. I did it freely. I did it with genuine affection for my sister and without a contract or expectation. I am not telling this story as a story of money owed. I am telling it as a story of what the money revealed, which is different. Brendan Holloway was 36 when he met Paige at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was in pharmaceutical sales, good-looking in the way of men who have always known they are good-looking and have built accordingly, confident in every room he entered and specifically skilled at making you feel, when his attention was on you, that you were the most interesting person in it. I noticed this quality in him at our first meeting and noted it without judgment, because charm is not a character flaw. Charm is simply a tool, and like all tools, what matters is how it's used and what it's used on. What I noticed in the months that followed was subtler and took longer to assemble into a pattern I trusted. Brendan had a relationship with the truth that was not dishonest exactly, but that was always arranged, always presented in the order and proportion that served the narrative he wanted the listener to carry away. He told stories about himself that were technically accurate but structurally flattering in a way that required you to not look too closely at the edges. He was skilled at the kind of conversation where he asked you questions and appeared to listen to the answers. But if you replayed the exchange, you would find that very little had been revealed about him and considerably more about you, and that the asymmetry had been comfortable rather than suspicious because he was so warm while it happened. I am a person who looks at edges professionally. It is the basis of my work. The edge is where the design decision lives, where the material meets the joint, where the choice becomes visible. I looked at Brendan's edges, in our first year of knowing each other, and what I found there was not conclusive, but was not clean either. I said nothing to Paige because nothing I had was specific enough to name. I had a feeling and a pattern and a professional instinct, and none of those are things you bring to your younger sister about her beloved without a much more solid foundation. The foundation arrived 8 months before the wedding, in the form of a direct message on my professional Instagram account. The message was from a woman named Tara Elgin, who identified herself as the mother of a 4-year-old boy named Marcus. She said she had found my account through the tag of a mutual friend who had attended a dinner party at a home I'd designed, and that she needed to speak with me because she believed I was related to Brendan Holloway's fiancé. She said she had been trying to reach Brendan for 2 years. She said Marcus was his son. I read this message 3 times. I want to be careful here about what I did next, because the careful part matters. I did not forward the message to Paige immediately. I did not call anyone. I sat with it for 24 hours, because a direct message from an unknown person making a serious claim is not, by itself, information. It is an allegation, and allegations require examination before they become the basis for action. I responded to Tara Elgin and asked if she would be willing to speak by phone. She called me the same evening. She was composed in the way of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has made peace with the weight of it, though not with the injustice of it. She told me that she and Brendan had dated for 2 years, 5 years before my sister met him. She told me the pregnancy had been unplanned and that Brendan's initial response had been supportive, but that support had degraded progressively over the course of her pregnancy and then collapsed entirely approximately 6 weeks after Marcus was born, when Brendan had, without announced decision or formal conversation, simply stopped responding to her messages. No calls returned, no visits to the child, no financial support, voluntary or enforced. Because Tara had not pursued legal paternity establishment at the time, initially believing Brendan would return, and then, when enough time had passed that she understood he would not, finding herself in a practical and emotional situation that made a legal fight feel like more than she could take on with an infant and a full-time job. She had tried to reach him twice in the years since, when the practicalities of raising a child alone had become acute enough that she needed to make another attempt. Both times, no response. She had found me, she said, because she had seen a photograph of a design event on a mutual connections account, had noticed my last name tagged in it, and had recognized the name from Brendan's social media, where he had posted occasionally about his fiancé's family. She was not asking me to do anything in particular. She said she thought someone in Paige's family should know, because she was not trying to destroy anyone's happiness, but that she also could not watch someone marry a man who had walked away from his own son without making one more attempt to put the truth in front of people who deserved to have it. I asked her if she had documentation. She said she had text messages from the period around the pregnancy, photographs of Brendan with Marcus as an infant, and medical records that named Brendan as the father, though without a legal paternity test. I asked if she would be willing to share those with me. She said she would. She sent them the following day. I examined them carefully. The text messages were extensive and consistent with her account. The photographs showed Brendan clearly, holding an infant, in what appeared to be a hospital setting. The medical records named him as the acknowledged father at the time of birth. This was specific enough to name. I called Paige on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks before the wedding invitations were due to go out. I asked her to come to my apartment. I told her I needed to talk to her in person about something important. She heard something in my voice and asked what was wrong. I said I would tell her when she arrived, which in retrospect was not the right answer, because it gave her 6 hours to call Brendan and tell him that her sister wanted to talk to her about something serious, which is what she did. Because Paige, to her credit, and in this case her disadvantage, is not a person who keeps things from her partner. By the time she arrived at my apartment that afternoon, Brendan had 6 hours to prepare. I showed Paige everything. I sat with her at my kitchen table and I walked her through it methodically. Tara's message, the phone call, the documentation, and I watched her face go through the particular sequence of expressions that a face goes through when it is confronting information it does not want and cannot immediately dismiss. I was calm. I did not editorialize. I presented the material the way I would present a structural finding to a client. Here is what I found. Here is what it means. Here is what I think you need to know before you proceed. Paige was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "I need to talk to Brendan." I said, "Of course." I said I was not telling her what to do. I said I was telling her what I knew because she was my sister, and she deserved to have this information. She said she would call me after she spoke to him. What Brendan told Paige, I learned later in pieces, through conversations and documents, and a clarity that arrived well after the moment when it could have changed anything. He told her that yes, he had briefly dated Tara Elgin, that the pregnancy had been complicated by serious doubts on both sides about whether the child was his, that the relationship had ended badly, and that Tara had a history of instability, and that what Diana had done, going behind Paige's back to contact a woman from his past, conducting what he described as an unauthorized investigation into his personal history, was a symptom of a pattern he had observed for the past year. Diana's inability to accept that Paige had found happiness with someone. Diana's history of positioning herself as the most important person in Paige's life. Diana's difficulty with the reality that marriage would necessarily change the dynamic between the sisters. He said this calmly. He said it with concern. He framed it as something he had been reluctant to bring up, but felt he owed Paige the honesty of naming. He said he loved her and was not asking her to choose, but that he needed her to understand what he had observed. This is the mechanism I did not anticipate, and the one I should have. I had spent 6 months observing Brendan's relationship with the truth, noticing the way he arranged it, the way the edges of his stories didn't quite meet. And I had failed to apply that observation to the specific scenario in which I confronted him indirectly. I had assumed that the truth, presented clearly, would be received as the truth. I had forgotten that a man who has spent his life managing perceptions is most dangerous when the perception he needs to manage is the most important one. Paige called me 2 days later. She was not angry, or rather, she was angry in the way of someone who has decided, in order to hold the life she has built, to locate the source of her anger somewhere other than where it actually resides. She said she was sorry about Marcus. She said she had spoken to Brendan at length, that things were more complicated than I understood, that they were going to address it properly after the wedding. She said she needed me to understand that she believed Brendan, and that what hurt her was not the information I had shared, but the way I had gathered it, going around her, investigating her relationship, treating her fiancé as a subject of inquiry. I said, I didn't investigate him. A woman contacted me. Paige said she understood that, but that I had chosen to pursue it rather than coming to her or Brendan first, and that choice had consequences. I said, I came to you as soon as I had something solid enough to bring. What would it have meant to come to him first? She said she thought we needed some space, and that she hoped we could talk more after the wedding when things were less heightened. I agreed to the space. I did not agree to the less heightened, because I did not believe it was coming. 3 weeks later, my mother called to tell me that the seating chart needed to be revised because some of Brendan's family was coming from further away than expected, and could I call the venue coordinator to arrange an additional table. I did this, which I should not have. Not because the call was difficult, but because it told me something about what I had accepted. The specific distance at which I had been placed, the fact that I was still doing operational work for an event from which I was being slowly repositioned to outside. I noted this and did not yet understand where it was going. The call on a Tuesday morning, 9 days before the wedding, was the destination. On the day the wedding happened, I was at my office. I had been at my office every day that week, because work is what I do when I have nothing else reliable to occupy my hands and my attention, and the week had been full of moments requiring me to not think directly about what was happening 37 miles away. I had transferred the vendor contracts. This had required 3 days of calls and emails and a conversation with the venue coordinator, a woman named Angie with whom I had worked on multiple events and who was professionally composed and personally appalled, as she indicated with the specific efficiency of someone who will not say what she thinks aloud, but communicates it clearly in the precise crispness of her administrative responses. Brendan's parents had assumed the contracts, absorbing the remaining balances and taking responsibility for communications. I had provided every file, every confirmation number, every correspondence chain. I had been meticulous. I had not wanted anything I'd handled to fail because of anything I'd left incomplete. Because this is who I am, and who I am does not change in response to how I am treated. I did not go to the venue. I did not drive past it. I made myself a dinner I didn't taste and sat in my living room in the apartment I had designed myself, in the space I had made to feel exactly the way I wanted to feel when I walked through the door, held, clear, like breathing room after a long time in compressed air. And I allowed myself, for one evening, to feel the full weight of it, not the money. I need to say that clearly, because it would be easy to read this story as a story about the money, and the money is not the point. $83,000 is a significant sum, and I will not pretend I am indifferent to it, because I am not a person who pretends. But what I felt that evening was not about the sum. It was about what the sum represented. A year of planning, of phone calls with vendors, of driving to floral showrooms and cake consultations and venue walkthroughs. A year of being the infrastructure of something I cared about because my sister cared about it, because I loved her, because being useful was how I loved people, and I had chosen to love her this way in the biggest way I knew how. And at the end of it, she had sat in a room with a man I had tried to warn her about and believed his version of who I was. And my parents had lined up behind her decision without calling me to ask what had actually happened, and I had been removed from the guest list of my own sister's wedding like a liability to be managed. That is what the $83,000 represents in this story. Not a debt. A measurement. An exact dollar figure on the precise value my family had assigned to my participation in their lives, and then declined to redeem. I sat with this for a long time. Then I made tea. Then I went to bed. Here is what I did not do in the months that followed. I did not send the documentation to Paige again. I did not call my parents to explain myself. I did not post anything on social media that referenced the situation, though there were moments. I am human. I am 41. I have feelings. When the temptation to simply let the truth be visible was significant. I did none of these things because I had made a decision the morning after the wedding, sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and a legal pad, which is where I do my clearest thinking. The decision was this: I would keep the documentation. I would keep Tara Elgin's contact information. I would maintain, in organized and secure form, every piece of evidence I had gathered: the messages, the photographs, the medical records, the text chain between Tara and Brendan, the timeline of the relationship as Tara had described it. I would not deploy it as a weapon. I would not use it to vindicate myself, because my vindication was not the point, and Paige's harm was not something I wanted to produce, even in the service of being right. But I would keep it, because I had been doing this work long enough to know that the evidence was not finished being relevant just because the immediate moment had passed. I also hired a family law attorney in Denver named Vivian Cross, whom I knew professionally from a design commission at her firm, to advise me in a limited capacity on what, if any, legal obligations I had regarding the documentation I held. Vivian told me that I had no legal obligation to come forward with information about a private individual's relationship history, and that my primary exposure was the outstanding financial question of the vendor contracts, which I had already resolved. She also told me something I had not thought to ask about: that in Colorado and several other states, paternity fraud and the willful concealment of a child from legal processes could have consequences in family law proceedings should Tara Elgin pursue them, and that the documentation I held might be relevant in such proceedings if they occurred. I filed this away and went back to work. In January, 4 months after the wedding, Paige called me for the first time since September. She did not call to apologize. She called because she was pregnant, and she was happy about it, and she was calling the people in her life she wanted to tell, and I was apparently still one of those people despite everything that had happened, which told me something about the resilience of the bond underneath the damage, and which I received with the complicated mixture of genuine joy for her and grief for us that constituted most of what I felt about Paige by then. I told her I was so glad. I meant it. We talked for 40 minutes about the pregnancy, carefully, avoiding everything that remained unaddressed between us, the way you navigate a room that has furniture moved to the wrong places, and you both know it, but neither one says anything yet. At the end of the call, she said, "Diana, I know things are not. And stopped. I waited. She said, I hope we can find our way back. I said I hoped so too. We said goodbye. She did not call again for 3 months. In April, 7 months after the wedding, Tara Elgin called me. She had, she said, finally retained a family law attorney and filed for paternity establishment and child support. She was calling to let me know, not to ask anything of me, but because she felt I had a right to know that the process had begun. She said her attorney had subpoenaed Brendan's financial records and communications, and that in the course of that process, certain things had come to light about the period of Marcus's birth that she felt confirmed everything she had told me. I asked if there was anything I could do. She said, You already did it. You listened, and you tried. That was more than most people. The paternity case was not something I was party to. I followed it only in the oblique way of someone who receives occasional updates from a person at the center of it. A paternity test confirmed Brendan as Marcus's biological father. The financial records subpoenaed in the discovery process revealed that during the period in which Brendan had claimed uncertainty about paternity and used that uncertainty to justify his absence, he had been in regular text contact with Tara's phone number, not responding, but the contact had been opened, which contradicted his claim of uncertainty. He had known. He had simply decided that the inconvenience of fatherhood was something he could step away from, the way you step away from a subscription you no longer want. Paige found out about the paternity result through Brendan, who was legally obligated to inform her. She found out about the text message records because Tara's attorney released them as part of the public record, and someone who knew Paige saw the coverage in a local legal news blog and sent it to her. She called me on a Thursday evening in June, 10 months after the wedding. It was a call I recognized immediately as different from every previous call, not because of what she said in the first 30 seconds, but because of the quality of the silence at the beginning of it. The silence of someone standing at the edge of something they have been avoiding for a long time, deciding whether to step off. She said, He lied to me about Marcus. I said, I know. She said, He told me you had gone looking for it, that you had hired someone to investigate him. I said, A woman messaged me on Instagram because she recognized my last name. I asked her for documentation before I came to you. That's all that happened. A long silence. She said, I knew that. I think I knew that. I did not say what I could have said, which was that she had known it and chosen the easier interpretation anyway, because the easier interpretation allowed her to get married in the ballroom I had booked, and wear the dress we had chosen together at a boutique in Cherry Creek, and be carried along by the momentum of a wedding she had been planning for over a year. I did not say it because it was true, but it was also something she was going to have to arrive at herself, and my saying it would only delay her arrival. I said, What do you need right now? She said, I don't know. I think I need you to not tell me you told me so. I said, I won't. She said, And I need to say I'm sorry. For September. For all of it. I let this sit for a moment because it deserved to sit. Not to be savored. That is not what I felt. But because an apology of that weight should be received with the attention it took to deliver, and Paige had taken real effort to get to it, and I knew it. I said, I accept that. I want you to know it's not a clean acceptance. What happened hurt me in ways I haven't fully said, and we're going to have to talk about them eventually. But I hear you, and I believe you mean it, and that matters. She cried. Paige cries differently than my mother. Where my mother's tears are a social instrument, Paige's are simply what happens when her composure reaches its limit, and you can hear the difference. I sat with her in it for a few minutes, on the phone, across 37 miles. Then she said, I found out something else. About the wedding. Brendan, in the course of the paternity proceedings and the marital conflict that followed, had made a comment to Paige in an argument, the kind of comment people make when they are defending themselves, and reach for the most damaging available material. He had told her that the reason he had pushed to have me removed from the wedding was not only what he had told her at the time, it was also because he had known, once Paige mentioned my call, that I had documentation of the Tara situation, and he had understood that a woman with my professional precision, sitting at a wedding, watching him, knowing what she knew, was a risk to the story he had built. He had needed me out of the room. He had used the tools available to him, Paige's existing insecurities about my relationship to the family, my parents' default alignment with Paige, the framing of me as jealous and controlling. And he had gotten what he needed. He had gotten what he needed because the architecture was already there. Because my family had spent 41 years constructing a system in which my love was expressed through usefulness, and my presence was accepted as infrastructure, and my concerns were received as interference. And Brendan had looked at that system and understood it in about 30 seconds, the way a competent person understands the load-bearing structure of any room they walk into. I did not say this to Paige. What I said was, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "What do I do?" "About Brendan, about all of it." I said, "That's not a question I can answer for you, but I can tell you that you're not alone in figuring it out, if you want that." She said she wanted that. The marriage lasted 14 months. Paige filed for divorce in November of the year following the wedding, citing irreconcilable differences, the language of a legal document trying to compress something much larger into a phrase that will hold up in court. Brendan contested it for a period, and then did not, and the proceedings concluded in the spring with an arrangement that took into account his financial obligations to Marcus as established in the paternity case, which had the specific effect of making him less financially comfortable than he had been and more legally visible than he preferred. I want to be precise about how I feel about this outcome, because I think precision matters here. I did not want Paige's marriage to fail. I had never wanted that. I had wanted her to know the truth before she committed to it, which is a different thing. The failure of the marriage was a real loss for her, and her grief about it was real. And I sat with her in that grief multiple times over the months of the proceedings, without once saying anything that positioned the outcome as justice rather than loss. Because for Paige, it was primarily loss. And she had not earned the position of someone who could experience it as justice. For me, quietly and privately, it was both. I hold both things honestly. The loss was my sister's, and I felt it with her. The clarity was mine, and I felt that separately. My parents, as the marriage dissolved, underwent a recalibration that I observed with the careful attention of someone who has been watching a structural situation for a long time and is finally seeing it revealed. My father called me in February of the year the divorce was finalized, which was the first time he had called me directly, without my mother on the line, since before the wedding. He said he wanted to explain himself. I told him I was listening. He was not a man of great eloquence, and what he produced was not eloquent. It was halting and partial, and arrived at its central point by a long and circuitous route. But the central point, when it arrived, was real. He said he had not stood up for me in September, that he had taken Carol's assessment and Paige's distress and Brendan's framing and assembled them into a conclusion without calling me to ask what had actually happened, and that he understood now that this was wrong, and that it was not the first time he had done something like it, and that he was sorry. I thanked him. I told him I had needed to hear that, and that I believed him. I told him sorry was a beginning and not an ending, and that what I needed from him going forward was to be treated as a person whose account of events was worth seeking out, rather than arriving at last after the event when everything had already happened. He said he understood. I believe he is trying. He is not a man built for self-examination, and trying, for him, is slower and less fluent than it would be for someone with more practice. But it is real. My mother is harder. My mother's recalibration has been more surface level and less structural. She has returned to warmth, to calling regularly, to the specific warmth of someone who has decided that the episode is over, and the appropriate response is to restore the previous temperature of the room. She has not said directly that she was wrong to line up behind Paige without hearing my account. She has communicated this indirectly, through attentiveness, and through a new habit of asking about my work, with a specificity she didn't previously bring to it. I receive this as partial. It is more than I had, and less than what would fully settle the account. I am patient with it because I understand that my mother's self-awareness operates at the pace it operates, and I cannot redesign the room she was built in. I can only be clear about what the room requires if I am going to keep coming back to it. Paige and I are rebuilding. I want to say this with the honest tentativeness it deserves, because rebuilding is not the same as rebuilt, and I will not present a conclusion before the structure is actually standing. We talk every week now. She asks about projects. She has come to Denver twice, and I have gone to her once, and the visits have had the texture of people relearning a language they spoke fluently once and then did not speak for a year and a half. Some things come back immediately, and some things require reaching. And occasionally, we both reach for the same word at the same moment and look at each other and feel, briefly and genuinely, that it is going to be all right. The money has not been repaid, and I have not asked for it, and I will not. This is not a generosity I am performing. It is a conclusion I reached after sitting with the question for a long time, because I am a person who sits with questions before answering them. The $83,000 funded a wedding that happened, in a venue I chose, with vendors I selected. And though I was not in the room, the wedding occurred and the money was spent on what it was spent on, and the financial transaction is complete. What is not complete is the relational one, and those run on different currencies, and complicating the relational repair with a financial claim is not something I am willing to do. I am an interior architect. I know what it means to take a wall down and find the room was always there, larger than the configuration suggested. I am not going to put a wall back up just because someone once stood on the wrong side of it. What I am left with, after all of it, is a set of things I have been arranging in my mind since the November evening when I sat in my living room and let the weight land, and which I want to put down clearly because I think the clarity is the point of any honest account. I was useful to my family for a long time in ways that were real and that cost me real things. I funded a wedding I was not invited to. I was removed from a guest list by a man who understood the architecture of my family's dynamics better than I had wanted to examine them, and who used that understanding deliberately and effectively. My parents did not ask me what had happened before accepting a version of events that positioned me as the problem. My sister chose the narrative that allowed her to proceed, and then had to live with what she'd chosen until the truth caught up in a courtroom 17 months later. All of this happened. I am not revising it to something tidier. What is also true, my father called me in February and said something real and difficult. My sister said I'm sorry in a voice I believe. Tara Elgin's son has a legal father and financial support, and a documented claim on someone who tried to walk away from him, and I had a small part in the chain of events that produced that outcome, which is not justice exactly, but is closer to it than where things were. And I am in my apartment tonight. In the living room I designed to feel the way I want to feel when I walk through the door, and the feeling is what I designed it to be. Like breathing room, like clarity, like a space that belongs entirely to the person inside it. This is what I have learned, building rooms for 20 years, about the most important thing a space can do. It should tell the truth about who you are, not who someone else decided to believe you were. Every design decision I make is oriented toward this. Light where it's true, weight where it belongs. Nothing decorative for its own sake, nothing structural hidden behind a surface that won't hold it. I built a room once that a client had been told was too small for what she wanted in it. She had owned it for 7 years and made peace with its limitations, arranged herself around them, told herself the space was insufficient. What I found when I looked was a load-bearing wall that was not load-bearing. It had been built as a partition, cosmetically, and was carrying nothing structural. We took it down, and the room doubled in size, and she stood in it for a long moment and said quietly, "It was always this big." Yes, it always was. I know what I am. I have always known. The evidence was always there for anyone willing to look at it. I documented everything, not out of vindictiveness, but because documentation is what you do when the truth is the thing most likely to be disputed. And I have spent 17 years understanding that the truth, assembled carefully and kept intact, will eventually find a room large enough to stand up in. I gave my family a room they did not let me into. I am building a different one now, one I designed myself, where the measurements are accurate, and the light is true, and the walls hold exactly as much as they say they do. That room has space for the people who come back honestly. It also has clearly marked the door that opens only from the inside. I know which one is mine. I always did.